All right, class, it's time for some math. So, LeBron is TikToking with his friends about the Fortnite, and he scores 3,000 points. Then he Instagram DMs and loses 2,000 points for being poggers. But then he earns 1,200 points for wearing some sus Crocs in sport mode. How many points does he have, all in all?
Tired of having your content sound like this when you want to make it relevant? Don't you wish you had some other tools to use?
Hi, we are Alex, Benedict, and Connor, and the goal of our presentation is to help equip teachers with new tools to effectively engage their students with their content. We know that it's important to make your content engaging to your students, but sometimes relating content to their lives isn't enough to actually motivate students and to have them perform well in your class. So we are going to suggest several mindset interventions that will effectively increase students' motivation and ultimately their educational outcomes. Before we begin with our 3 recommendations about how to increase student motivation, we are going to define what a mindset intervention is. A mindset intervention is when you positively change the way a student thinks and feels about themselves and their schoolwork. We know that mindset interventions lead to higher educational achievements. In this presentation, we are recommending that teachers promote the relevance of their classroom material to our students' lives, motivate students to have transcendent thinking, and that teachers promote a growth mindset in their students.
Our first recommendation is to have an intervention to promote the material's relevance to the students and their perception of the material's relevance. The goal of this kind of intervention is for the students to internalize the reason for engaging in the activity in the hopes that they will be more willing to actively engage in the classroom and the class rules. Our goal with this kind of intervention is to develop a self-oriented mindset in the students. A self-oriented mindset is when students are motivated by the perceived relevance and utility of what they are learning to their own personal life. In 2009, Holman and Herakowitz implemented a study where they attempted to have an intervention to promote the utility value of material in a science class to high school students. So 262 students were assigned essays after each unit. There are 2 groups, a control group and a relevancy group. In the control group, the students just wrote an essay summarizing what they had learned. In the relevancy group, students wrote an essay describing how the material they learned was relevant to their own lives. The results of this study found that students who were in the relevancy group, who initially reported low expectations of success in the class, had significantly higher interest in the material and grades in that material than those in the control group. Students who had high expectations of their own success at the beginning of the class were mostly unaffected. So, what we can conclude from the study is that interventions that promote the utility value of the material to the students are very effective for promoting interest and performance in students who have low expectations, the students we're most trying to reach with our material. In that experiment, students generated their own ideas for the relevance of the material. So the question becomes, is it better to directly instruct the relevancy of the material or to have students come up with their own ideas? In a study in 2015 by Canning and Herakowitz, the experimenters tried this. This is a study that happened with college students, and there were 3 studies that helped determine the effectiveness of utility value interventions. The first one studied the effect of direct instruction versus self-generated utility value interventions. The second one gave a combined direct instruction and self-generated intervention. And the third one was a comparison of giving high or low stakes utility value interventions to low confidence students, as in, is the material helpful to you getting a career and getting a good job, or is it something that you can use in your everyday life? The first study found that self-generated interventions, where students came up with their own ideas for how the material was relevant, increased performance but not interest for low confidence students. Directly instructed value, where the teacher told the students directly how the material was useful, actually decreased both performance and interest for low expectation students. The second study gave a combined self-generated and directly instructed intervention. This found that a combination of the two directly increased performance and interest as well as perceived utility of the material for low confidence students. In the third intervention, the study found that reducing the threat of directly communicated interventions by focusing on day-to-day relevance had positive effects on the performance and interest in low expectation students. So some conclusions that we can draw from all those graphs. First of all, self-generated relevancy is effective at promoting all students' high and low expectations performance on tasks. Self-generated discovery might not increase interest, however. Mixing the two can promote both performance and interest. The study also found that direct instruction can cause lower performance and interest for low confidence students. And it did find that focusing directly instructed value interventions on low stakes relevancy, as in things that are relevant to your everyday life, versus high stakes in the future, can increase interest for low confidence students. So how do we create an environment that promotes the relevance of content? There are two factors that help students foster a sense of personal meaning. First of all, autonomy, one of the three basic needs of students. Fulfilling students' needs to make them feel that they have a personal choice in the classroom. Secondly, it's important to have the right kind of rationale. You want to give students a reason why they should learn the material. If there's a good combination of rationale for the material that shows that it is specific and concrete and novel for the students, and a climate of autonomy where students feel that they have choice in the classroom, there'll be a good environment to support students seeing the material as relevant to them. Our recommendation is to create an intervention to support the relevance of class with students in this kind of environment. The first part of this is creating a positive environment of autonomy in the classroom. Students should feel that they have a choice in assessment. If they feel that they have a choice, they own the material and what they learn a little bit more. Teachers should be connecting with their students, knowing what they like, and having that influence what is being taught in the classroom. Teachers should also be thinking about the student perspective on why the material is relevant. And secondly, we should encourage students to see the utility value of the material. Having students write about how they see themselves using the material in their lives is a great way of making them think about how it is relevant and therefore increasing their interest in their performance. Giving a direct instruction of the material as well helps make sure that it is supporting especially those low expectation students, as those studies showed, and therefore increasing their performance, their interest, and their perceived notion of the material as valuable. One possible obstacle to this kind of intervention is if a teacher feels that the material in their curriculum is imposed on them and they don't think it's that useful either. In this case, the teacher should look at the material from their student's perspective and see how it could be good and useful for them. The teacher has to model the utility value thinking themselves. If the students see the teacher doesn't care about the material, they won't either. Another possible obstacle is unconfident students feeling overwhelmed by the utility intervention. This is something that happened in the studies that we looked at. In this case, focus that directly instructed value on the day-to-day use of the material and talk with students about how what you're learning might be useful for budgeting up to buy a new bike, not saving up for a 401k.
All right, so our second recommendation flows kind of seamlessly from the first one, which is to motivate transcendent thinking. There's a lot of research that indicates that the teachers who foster transcendent motivation and transcendent thinking about education actually aid the students in educational attainment and also personal development. So let's define terms a little bit here. What is self-transcendent, a self-transcendent mindset or self-transcendent motivation? It's driven by a combination of religious, spiritual, sacred, literally anything that is beyond your personal motivations. And it's coupled with a desire especially to be a part of something greater than yourself. So the main study upon which we're going to explore self-transcendent thinking is Boring But Important, a Self-Transcendent Purpose for Learning Fosters Academic Self-Regulation. Conducted in 2014, it kind of examines the influence of transcendent thinking on a variety of different forms of student achievement, especially perseverance. And it also designs interventions to help students achieve a greater transcendent way of thinking about education. So while not all of the studies in the actual research received this intervention, a couple of them were focused on this purpose for learning intervention, which is seeking to inculcate in students this transcendent mindset. So it's designed really as an enzyme, that's what the researchers called it, which helps students kind of elicits their own thinking on the topic, as opposed to telling them they need to think this way about the transcendent matters of education. So in order to do it, students were given the prompt below and asked to write an open-ended essay where they responded to that prompt. And they were also exposed to a number of different statistics, all of which are true, and quotes that indicate that students are actually truly motivated by like a broader positive contribution to the world. Great, so a quick orientation of the results of 2 of the 4 studies that were included in this piece of research. On the left, we've got on the y-axis, the percent of students who persist at a 4-year college, and on the right, the degree to which they endorsed a self-transcendent purpose for their own education. And then on the right graph, the y-axis is the average GPA in STEM courses. For the 4th quarter, the intervention was given to high school students at the end of their 3rd quarter. And on the x-axis, we've got the populations of all students, and then the populations of those who had a pre-intervention average of below 3.0, so those who wouldn't stand to benefit the most from an intervention like this. You can see the results that kind of speak for themselves. Period. All right, so how do we apply the results of that research to our classrooms? Our first recommendation is to have students draw connections between their own education right now, their future career aspirations, and what the world needs of them. Frameworks that you can visualize to the side, like the Ikigai concept or the hedgehog concept, can really help students kind of realize what they're good at, the way that society places kind of an obligation on them to serve it. You can also model the diversity of motives behind professional choice by talking about the things that caused you to be a teacher, whether those are more self-oriented, but particularly in this context, especially self-transcendent values that made you pursue your line of work. And then finally, some limitations. Obviously, if we're talking about professional life, probably not appropriate to talk about it with pretty much anybody younger than upper middle school students. So apropos the first recommendation, the second recommendation is really to make explicit the connections to the students on the nature of this, whatever particular class they're in, and also the spiritual and religious nature of Catholic education in all classes. So this is a great way for the students to make those connections. Again, you don't want to tell a group of students that this is the way they ought to think about this. So these kinds of interventions are modeled pretty much directly off the research. A couple notes: is really important to include statistics about the way that other students conceive of beyond the self motivation. These are really not going to be super time consuming about the one class period, and that can provide a lot of support for students to cultivate that beyond the self mindset. And it's important to additionally tailor it to your school's particular context. If you don't have a majority of Catholic students, for instance, it might not be appropriate to include as explicit connections to some nitty-gritty aspects of the Catholic faith. A limitation of this, as with most things, would be, yeah, you're sacrificing one class time for it.
Our third and final recommendation is that teachers promote a growth mindset in their classrooms. All a growth mindset is just convincing students that their intelligence is something that can grow. So in your own life, you've probably seen growth mindset and fixed mindset kind of being contrasted with each other. So basically a fixed mindset is when students or people think that their intelligence is just stagnant. There's no way that they can become smarter in any way. They're just like naturally, inherently smart. No movement in their level of intelligence. A growth mindset, on the other hand, is when people, and particularly students, believe that their intelligence can be grown through due effort, through challenge seeking, through different kinds of tasks. So teachers, if they work to teach students how to have a growth mindset and promote a growth mindset in their classroom, can help increase student motivation and achievement. To support this, we looked at a national experiment revealing where growth mindset improves achievement. So this was from the National Study of Learning Mindsets, and its purpose was to figure out what kind of students and what kinds of classrooms and where students most benefited from a growth mindset. So they surveyed 65 regular public schools in the United States, and the population of students was reflective of the population of the United States, which means it's generalizable across all schools in the nation. So just like one other thing about the study is that they defined students who were low achieving as having GPAs lower than the median GPAs of students at their respective schools. During this experiment, students were randomly chosen to either be in the control group or in the experimental group. And there were 2 sessions that each group's experienced about 3 weeks apart. And so for the experimental group, the first session was dedicated to teaching that an individual's intellectual abilities can be developed in response to effort, taking on challenging work, improving one's learning strategies, and asking for appropriate help. While the second session of that experimental group was invited students to deepen their understanding of the growth mindset idea and its application to their lives. The control, on the other hand, also had these sessions, but the sessions didn't touch on intelligence. It just taught students about the brain. So these are the results of the studies. If you notice, so this top part is the results of the lower achieving students, like those students who had a GPA lower than the median at their school, and then this bottom one was the just overall students who were surveyed. Those lower achieving students had a greater impact on their GPA than students overall. So we're highlighting math and science GPAs here. If you notice in that lower achieving group, you had a higher value than the students overall. So what does that mean? It means that the growth mindset intervention actually increased student outcomes. Those B values were positive, and so that shows that students' GPAs increased when they had the growth mindset intervention. But not only that, your lower achieving students benefited even more than your higher achieving students. So growth mindset interventions are so helpful for your lower achieving students. One of the reasons that your high achieving students don't see that same amount of increase in their GPAs is because they probably already have a high GPA and it doesn't really have the ability to increase that much. But what the study did find is that those high achieving students were more likely to enroll in advanced math courses during their 10th grade year because of the growth mindset intervention. So what are some takeaways? Well, teachers should promote a growth mindset in their classroom. They have to teach students that their intelligence is malleable, right? We should be using these growth mindset lesson plans. There are a number of TED Talks, Khan Academy videos that you can use to help teach students that intelligence can be grown. Follow these with a discussion or a writing assignment, and you will see increases in achievement. Further, you need to build classroom and school-wide norms that promote challenge seeking, right? Clearly define your expectations and reinforce them. It can be challenging to find the time to do this in your classroom because you have so much curriculum to go through, but it actually does increase student engagement and motivation and achievement, so it's important. Take the time. It can also be challenging to implement school-wide norms, especially if other teachers in your classroom or in your school have a fixed mindset. So it might take some convincing to get them to kind of use these, but it is worthwhile. All right, so we're going to leave you with a couple of questions here that we will discuss in our live session. So the first question is, how did you motivate students in your classroom? Or, if you're new to this, what do you plan to do to motivate students? When did you feel most motivated in classes this summer? What role should motivating students through engaging materials have in the classroom? How can we provide parents and guardians with resources to motivate their children? What challenges do you anticipate in motivating your students? And finally, why is it the teacher's job to motivate students? All right, think about those, and thank you so much for watching our presentation.